I was asked to give a little history of the Schellenberg family, the way my mother and dad went from their birth. My dad was born in 1869 in the Ukraine, and he came from a fairly large family, and they were farmers. But my dad managed to get an education and became a school teacher. And you know how school teachers move from place to place, and when he was a fairly young man, I think it was about 25, 26, 28, I'm not sure, he took a school in the Crimea, and that's where he met my mother, who was approximately 10 years younger than him. And he fell madly in love and persuaded her to marry him. And he told her, my mother told me, he always told me, if you marry me, I'll put you in a glass cage and just admire you. She says, and he never did that. But anyhow, they had, by 1903, they had 6 children. And he told me himself that when, if he stayed in Russia, and that was a good life at that time for the Mennonites down there, he would be able to have a good life, a fairly reasonable living, and he would have prestige, but he could never afford to give his boys an education, and he was very much for an education. So he decided to emigrate to Canada. It caused quite an uproar in the family, in my mother's family. They were very angry about it, but he stuck with this, and at 1903, he managed to get started for Canada. Well, he got to the Russian border, and the Canadian doctors turned him down. So, because he had trachoma, they said. So he went home and had some treatments, got started again, was turned down a second time at the border. And he came back and took some more treatments and started again, and he managed to get through and got as far as Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the boat, where they deplaned, or what you call it. And darned if the doctors didn't stop them again, and more treatment. So my mother, with 6 children, the youngest one 2 months old, that was my sister Helen, took off by train alone. She had a little thing to look after. Mind you, my sister Ann was about 7 or 8 years old then, and she was a big help, and Jake was 9 years old. Well, my cousin of my father's from Gretna, Mr. Dave Schellenberg, met them, the mother and children, in Winnipeg, and took them to his home, where they stayed until Dad came about a month or 2 later. And then but the first thing he did was go to school for 6 months to learn English. It was horrible English, but he went teaching after that, and he taught school in Manitoba first, and finally he came to Saskatchewan, and he taught school at Goldtown in Saskatchewan. And after a year or so, he took a homestead, which was always his plan, and started breaking soil and so on. They built a little sod house and a sod barn, and about 2 years later, they had a prairie fire come along and clean them up. My dad and Jake harnessed the horses to the plow and tried to plow spare brakes, you know, but the fire was coming much too fast. Somebody had burnt a straw stack, and all that prairie was a high grass, you know, it was not cultivated at all. And so he managed to run the horses and him and Jake into the slough that they had for cattle, water for the cattle. My mother jumped from one fire break to the next one, and with the children, and managed to save them all. The only one that died, that wasn't one of the children, but the dog ran back into the house and was killed. But after that, they rebuilt, and that's when my father made himself a pretty sick man for a while. He tried to dig a root cellar, you know, and 2 feet down, he ran into heart pain, and it gave him a double hernia. And he never was the same for a long time after. I know he was strong because when I was a kid, and he was, my older brothers were teenagers, they challenged him to a wrestle quite often. And it was a boom bang, and they were on the ground on their backs. But he started fading quite badly. He went from Saskatchewan after all those bad years when they were hailed out and burnt out. He finally gave up the farm. He didn't sell the farm. He kept that farm, and my brother Jake took it over in 1921. And he went back to teaching in Manitoba. And he taught until about 1932 or 33, and then they retired him on a great big pension of $18 a month. And he went back to Saskatchewan, lived on that land, on the farm for one winter, and then he bought a little house, a two-room house in this town of Herbert, and that's where he lived until he died. And we saw him there several times. We lived in Calgary at the time, and we'd drive down to Herbert for the summer for our holidays. And he was not strong. He was getting weaker and weaker, and on January 26th, I think it was, 1941, he had a massive heart attack and died in bed just like that. Well, my mother, she was 10 years younger, and she lived to 80. The last few years she spent in the Steinbach Senior Citizens Home here, and she kept fairly well until what was it? I don't remember the exact date. Pardon? 40s. She got pneumonia and she passed away. Most of us were at her bedside. Else, I think it was one of my mother's brothers, somebody in that family. They were in the Crimea, and you know the Crimean War was on in the early 60s. But my dad wasn't born until 69. This was before his time. And the Mennonites they didn't do military service, so they had to provide bread for the troops. What they did, the whole village would get together and they'd bake a whole pile of bread, roast it, Reisches. Anybody that knows German knows what that is. And they put it in a great big wagon, and one man would be picked to haul it to the front. They went very far away from the Russian and Turkish front. And I know they got down there, and the Russian soldiers are very fond, the Russian people are very fond of children. And they made such a big fuss over this lad that he was really enjoying himself, and all of a sudden the Turks started throwing over a few shells, so they rushed him back to the back and he went home. But those are little things that he experienced and that he told us at the time. He was quite a pioneer, you know. The fact alone that he came to this country when nobody else from that family was coming, they more or less made him a pioneer. And I was about 15, 16 when the Peace River country was opened up for homesteading. And I told him, as soon as I get old enough, I'm going up there. He said, I don't blame you. If I was 10 years younger, I'd go too. But they had quite a lot of trouble with the family. They separated. They were so angry at him for taking their mother away from the family that they were really not on speaking terms. Well, in 1913, after they had a good crop and they were well established, he wrote to my mother's sister and told her, now we're well established, let's forget bygones and we are happy here, please let's get together again. And she wrote back, she says, we will never forgive you for breaking up the family. And it was left at that, and they must have been sorry 1,000 times for not going when he did, because they were my stepfather, my step-grandfather, my mother's stepfather. They took him out one night and shot him. My mother's youngest brother, John, he was a school teacher, and he had been teaching in a certain school where the Germans, you know, when the Germans came during the Great World War, First World War, they came well into Russia, and they had got this far, and they had, some of the Mennonites had complained to the Germans that they'd been beaten by the Russians. So they whipped these guys. And when the Russians came back and the Germans left, they asked who was at that beating. The school teacher. In the meantime, the school teacher left and my Uncle John had taken the school, and they took him out one night and shot him. That was all there was to it. Now that's a bit of the history of the Schellenberg family. I don't know if I can tell you any more, but thanks for listening.
Thanks, Uncle Pete. You know, when that prairie fire went through and burnt the house, we were there in '39. We visited that area, and Leona, did you find the little picture, or was it Daddy that found it? I know you found a dime. You sold it to Daddy several times. But there was a little picture that had been out of Aunt Kathleen's tea set, and a dime that we found where that house had been burned by the prairie fire.